Welcome to today's Competitive Enterprise Institute Book Forum with the great Tevi Troy and his new book, The Power and the Money: How the Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. I'm your host today. I'm Ryan Young, Senior Economist here at CEI. For those of you who are new to CEI or don't know what we're about, we are a think tank based here in DC. We focus on the regulatory aspects of several issues, from the regulatory process itself to technology and antitrust to energy and the environment. And our guest today, because we also like to talk about bigger ideas that are less granular than individual regulations, is Tevi Troy, who might be one of the most distinguished speakers we have had here outside of the occasional Nobel laureate. Tevi has affiliations with the Bipartisan Policy Center, Yeshiva University Strauss Center, and the Mercatus Center at George University. He has also worked both in the White House and on Capitol Hill, and you've worked at least one regulatory agency. Two. And we're not done yet. He has a PhD in American civilization from the University of Texas at Austin, and I hold in my hand some proof that he has put that PhD to good use. So Tevi, welcome to CEI. We're happy to have you. And also, since in lieu of books for sale, we have these QR codes that you can scan to purchase your own copy. The book is hot off the press. It came out on August 20, so just about 1 week ago. And I highly recommend the book, as well as its predecessor, which is called Fight House, which is about the in-house staff clashes at the White House that have occurred over the many years. So Tevi, my first question for you, since not everyone has yet read the book, what's your 30-second elevator pitch version for what's it about?
Well, thanks, Ryan, for having me, and thanks to CEI for hosting this event. My book is about presidents and CEOs, the 150-year history of presidents in the United States and their clashes, sometimes collaborations, with big-name CEOs of top companies. And this goes back to John D. Rockefeller in the 1870s, and it goes all the way up to Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg of today. And that story of how these CEOs built their companies and how presidents often reacted to them and built the regulatory state is really the story of the development of modern America.
That's pretty good. And I will say, you spin a lot of good yarns in this book. You are a fantastic storyteller, and that comes through time and again, from Rockefeller all the way up to Mark Zuckerberg today. What inspired this book? Did you have some kind of flashbulb moment? Did it build upon earlier work? What got you interested in expressing the relationship between business and government in this way, by talking about CEOs and presidents?
Well, Ryan, as you said earlier, I've written other books. This is my 5th book on the presidency. And as I look at it, I realize that all of my books are about presidents and blank. The blank is something that nobody's ever covered before, and also something that speaks to our current moment. You kindly mentioned my book, Fight House. In the late 2010s, people were talking about all the infighting in the Trump White House. So I decided to do a deep dive exploration of infighting in the White House to see if it had happened in previous administrations before the Trump administration. Spoiler alert, it did.
I was just going to ask you that.
And so now I was looking for a new topic that would speak to our current moment. And what I noticed is that CEOs and big companies are more powerful than ever before. They affect so many aspects of our lives. I mean, the iPhones we carry, the cars we drive, the fuel that powers the cars. I mean, these all come from big corporations. But at the same time, CEOs seem more unpopular than ever. And we're in a weird moment where both Democrats and Republicans seem to hate corporations. And so I thought now is as good a time as any to explore the history of CEOs and their big corporations and big government.
A theme in this book, and in some of your past books, is conflict. Fight House was about conflict inside the White House between staffers who work for the same boss, belong to the same party. This book, The Power and the Money, is about external conflicts between presidents and CEOs who are outside the White House. Is that through line from book to book intentional, or did it just happen to be that way?
Well, you kindly said I spin a good yarn. And I think good yarns come from good material, and that often comes from conflict. I mean, a bunch of people sitting around a fireplace and singing Kumbaya isn't that interesting a book. But a book about people undercutting each other and fighting and having titanic egos and having high stakes, which is what we have both in this book, in The Power of the Money, and also in Fight House, I think that makes an interesting tale. And so, yes, conflict is definitely part of my brand.
Another theme I noticed is something that we at CEI try to emphasize, and that is the difference between being pro-business and in being pro-market. If you're pro-business, you might think that what's good for GM is good for America, or that the best way to exit a financial crisis is to bail out large financial institutions. That's very pro those businesses. But we at CEI prefer a pro-market approach, where you want an open and fair competitive process that anybody can participate in, and where you succeed by creating value for customers and consumers. You mentioned that both parties are pretty hostile to CEOs. There's an anti-business streak going on there, but there's also a pro-business streak going on at the same time. Can you unravel that a little bit, and also maybe comment on if either party has any semblance of a pro-market streak as distinct from a pro-business or an anti-business streak?
Well, I think that was succinctly and well stated about the distinction between pro-business and pro-market. And I think it is an important distinction, and I am with you on the pro-market side. But you're right. These CEOs, they don't have the interest of the market in mind. They have the interests of their business in mind. And that's their job. Their job is to create shareholder value. I remember when I worked, you mentioned that I worked in regulatory agencies. The first one I worked in was the Department of Labor. And my boss was Elaine Chao, who was a very skilled and very smart cabinet secretary. She was at the time head of labor. She later became head of transportation. And I remember she said to me, don't count on these corporate executives in the foxhole. They won't be with you on a tough fight. They're with you when you're doing something that helps their business, but they're not with you in the larger ideological struggle. And I think that really stuck with me, that you have the sense that businesses are there and they're lobbying on behalf of business, and that's what they should do. Now, there have been some exceptions. In my book, I do talk about a couple of corporate executives who really tried to see what the country needed at key moments. J.P. Morgan helped bail the economy out in two crucial moments in the crises of 1893 and 1907. You had John D. Rockefeller try to help prop up the economy in the Great Depression. Didn't work, but he did try. Henry Ford, despite his hatred of Franklin Roosevelt, builds the largest armaments factory in the U.S. at Willow Run, and he has Roosevelt visits the Willow Run facility, and it's so vast that they have to travel around in a car. Of course, they travel around in a Ford. And Ford, who hates Roosevelt, is jammed in the back seat of this car with Eleanor Roosevelt on one side of him and Franklin Roosevelt on the other side. And across from him in the jump seat is his son Edsel. And Edsel, who knew how much his father hated the Roosevelts, said his dad was giving him the stink eye the whole time. But for the most part, these corporate executives have been interested in being pro-business, meaning their business. A great example of this is Lee Iacocca. He first shows up in a character in The Power and the Money as a kind of pro-free market, anti-regulatory guy who comes to the Nixon White House to argue against Naderite regulations being imposed on the auto industry. And then as time goes on, he evolves, and the auto industry gets all these challenges from competition from Japan and abroad, and suddenly they want government intervention. And so he is buddies with Jimmy Carter in leading to the Chrysler bailout of the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, he's arguing with Ronald Reagan for anti-market regulatory actions that would help his company. Now, Ronald Reagan had very little patience for it, and I have this great story in The Power of the Money where Reagan doesn't accept Iacocca's arguments in favor of a gas tax, and he tells him that Reagan would be blamed every time people pumped up their cars with gas, and they'd call it the Reagan tax. And then he says to Iacocca, that's why I'm on this side of the desk and you're on that side. So Iacocca's attempts to bring his anti-market interests met their limits with Ronald Reagan.
It seems to me that's a common tale, a journey like Iacocca's, moving from relatively pro-market to solidly pro-business, whether that happens to coincide with free market policy or not. Have you seen a similar trajectory in any of today's more famous CEOs?
Well, you look at someone like Bill Gates, who I think also has an interesting evolution. Bill Gates of the 1980s was not the Bill Gates that we think of today as kind of the avuncular philanthropist. I mean, he was a hard-charging business executive. There were all these jokes about Microsoft, such as the Microsoft programmer joke, which is Windows ain't done until Lotus don't run. Lotus was the competing IBM product, and so they would set up the Microsoft product so that the competitors' products wouldn't work as well on their operating systems. And Gates takes he takes a very hard-charged approach to not only business and pushing out his competitors, but also to government. And when government starts to look into his business practices, he's all in fight mode. And it doesn't necessarily work for him because the business is, as he says, faster than government, but it's not bigger and it's not stronger than government. So I think Gates of the 1980s is a very different Gates than the Gates we know of today.
Well, CEOs are humans too. They don't just have our virtues, they also have all of our faults, and that can include giving into temptations for easy money from possibly unethical sources. Another theme that jumped out at me, a lot of our work at CEI focuses on formal institutions. And institutions, think of those as the rules of the game. The way the regulatory process is structured, or the separation of powers, or the way our court system is built. Those are institutions, and a lot of our work focuses on those formal institutions as they exist, how we can improve them. Your book focuses also on institutions, but it's more about informal institutions, personal relationships, gentlemen's agreements, that sort of thing. Could it be that a lot of we think tankers are missing out on something very important?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is really the intangibles. And one of the points I make in The Power and the Money is this idea that if there are two companies or two industries who are conflicting with one another on an important regulatory issue, they basically are going to fight themselves to a draw in terms of lobbying resources, in terms of advertising resources. There's only so much you can spend on lobbying. And what I argue in The Power and the Money is that sometimes CEOs can be the tiebreaker. So if you have a CEO who has good relations in Washington, who wants to be involved in Washington, he can shape the debate in a way that a CEO who's just focused on, let's say, the bottom line and the logistics of the company is not going to be able to. So CEOs can bring this added advantage to a company if they get involved in Washington and are strategic and talented and skillful in the way they do it.
So part of the modern CEO skill set isn't just management or entrepreneurship or decision making. Part of it's also their Rolodex. Is that something that's become more true over time, or less true, or about the same?
The Rolodex is definitely important, but the Rolodex in Washington in particular is what I focus on in The Power and the Money. You look at someone like Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase and a very skillful operator. I talk about him a lot in the book. And one thing I noticed that jumped out at me about Dimon, there were a couple of things that he's really smart about. So number one is when he started as CEO, he used to come to DC twice a year. And he realized that wasn't enough. He started coming twice a month. That's a big use of corporate resources. You know, the number one value you have if you're in the C-suite is the CEO's time. And they are choosing to use the CEO's time in that way by bringing him to Washington twice a month. And in doing so, you can't meet the same people. I mean, you can't come meet the Secretary of the Treasury every time. You get to meet other officials. And so regardless of who wins this upcoming election, Jamie Dimon is going to know people in senior roles in either administration. The second thing that Dimon does that I think is clever is he has this construction where he describes himself as barely a Democrat. Now, Democrats hear that and say, oh, well, there's this corporate CEO who's not a Republican. He's a Democrat. I like that. And Republicans hear that and they hear the barely So they hear the first two words. Democrats hear the third word. And when Republicans hear the barely they think, hey, this guy, maybe he's a Democrat, but he's against the excesses of the woke left. He's not a squad member. So he's okay with us, even though he might be nominally a Democrat. He's someone who we can deal with.
Do you think that kind of triangulation, whether with Dimon or with other executives playing the same game, do you think that's sincere? Do you think they're putting on a show, or do you think it's a little bit of both?
It's definitely a little bit of both, but what I argue in The Power of Money is that if you view how CEOs deal with Washington as some kind of a soundboard, you want to push up the engagement to the highest level. You want to be as engaged as you can, but you want to pull down the partisanship. You don't want to pick one side too strongly, because if the other side's in power, well, then you're in trouble. So I think Dimon is very clever and artful about the way he has the engagement at 11, if you will, but he brings the partisanship down relatively low. And in fact, sometimes when he oversteps in the Trump administration, he made some offhand comment about how if he ran against Trump for president, he would win. And he recognized almost immediately that was a problem. Trump puts out a pretty critical tweet of him, and Dimon apologizes and says he's not doing that. So he recognizes what the limits are and where he can go and where he can't.
There's a common tendency with most people to view things in binaries, and one example of that is people tend to think of things as either you have the government over here and you have the private sector over here, and never the twain shall meet. I don't think that's true. Whether you're talking about the airline industry or the healthcare industry or the auto industry, or these days, increasingly, the semiconductor industry. It's not really part of either. And there's a whole emerging field in political economy called entangled political economy that says it's not either or, it's both. Business and government are entangled, and each industry and each company is entangled in a unique way. I think your book is a perfect example of entangled political economy. So my question for you is, from Rockefeller to the present, which is the scope of your book, has that entanglement changed in any fundamental way? Are things more entangled, less entangled, differently entangled?
Well, absolutely. And Ryan, if you do encounter one of those people who think that government's here and business is here and never the twain shall meet, send them my way. I will show them the power of the money and tell them to read it, to disabuse them of that notion. But what I talk about in the book is the evolution, or maybe devolution, of how things have changed over time. The Rockefeller chapter I intentionally called the blank slate, because Rockefeller was building his empire without any government intervention or the ability of government to intervene. There were no regulatory bodies, there was no Sherman Antitrust Act, there were no regulations that could have stopped what he was doing. Whereas over time, the government has developed massive regulatory apparatuses plus a massive number of regulations, and they can shape what companies do. That doesn't mean that companies can't make a profit. Obviously, companies are very successful, and some of them make huge profits. But it means that government regulations and actions are shaping what the companies do to advance what the government wants them to accomplish in many ways. And I don't use the word entanglement so much as enmeshment. I think the two sides are enmeshed in a way that they absolutely weren't back in the Rockefeller era, and they're increasingly so over time.
Do you think there are any ways to possibly reduce that entanglement? It'll never go away. The real world just isn't built that way. But do you think there's some ways to reduce it or reduce its harmful effects? Or do you think we're doomed? Not in general, but do you think we're doomed to an eternity of cronyism and public-private partnerships?
Well, I'm never one to believe we're doomed. I got involved in this business because I'm inherently an optimist. My first boss in Washington was a guy named Ben Wattenberg, who was a congenital optimist. And he told me that things can improve. And we've seen many things improve over our lifetime. Some things have gotten worse also. But I'm in this business because I think things can get better. And I'm a proponent of regulatory reform. I think that there are things that some presidential candidates over time, maybe not either of them right now, but presidents have talked and presidential candidates have talked about regulatory reform. There are a lot of interesting ideas out there. CEI has talked about regulatory reform. I think there should be some kind of regulatory scorecard where agencies have to say what the costs are of all their regulations, what the benefits are, and actually not go over a certain amount in terms of costs over benefits. And I think they should be able to enforce that with some kind of hammer, whether it's a congressional hammer or OMB hammer within the administration. So I think regulatory reform can get things back to a more stable equilibrium where they're not as enmeshed. It's never going to go away, as you say, but I think things can improve, and that's why I'm in this business. That's why I write the things I write.
Yeah, there's a lot we can do on transparency. You've hit on a couple of ideas that I've been working on for as long as I've been here. But you have a history PhD. I have a history bachelor's. So as an old history major, one of the things I enjoyed studying in your book is not just the history itself, the facts and the stories, but the way you approach it. One way to view history is as the product of great forces. That's more of the Leo Tolstoy view of history. Napoleon didn't do what he did because of his great personality. There were larger forces like a reaction against the Enlightenment and the birth of nationalism that led him to do what he did. There's also, opposite the great forces view of history, the great personalities view of history, such as CEOs and presidents. Do you think that those personalities are the driving forces of the stories you tell in your book, or do you think larger forces such as a general rise in the role of the state or the ebbs and flows of populism over the decades, things like that have more to do with how the stories in your book turn out?
I think personalities are hugely important. You look at someone like John D. Rockefeller, who built the energy industry in this company. He called his company Standard Oil because he was establishing a standard for what oil products should be. Before that, oil was either ineffective or unreliable or combustible. And so he said, if you buy Standard Oil products, you know what you are getting. It was a kind of form of private sector regulation. I mean, he built that industry by force of will. That said, oil was going to be part of the American economy. It always was going to be. It just was shaped in the way it was by Rockefeller and his personality. So I think both are important. And what I try and get at in this book is both the larger forces at work and what's been happening and how the country has changed over these last 150 years, but also the degree to which these personalities, both presidential and corporate, shaped it.
Yeah, I mean, any mature thinker will say both great forces and great personalities. The question, and I don't think this debate will ever end, is what's the balance? It can change over time. It can change with the people involved. But your book is mostly about personalities, so you've told some good stories from your book so far, but do you have a favorite personality or a favorite story that reveals a personality that you encountered while you were writing the book?
One of my favorite characters in the book is someone who I hadn't thought that much of before I wrote the book, is Lew Wasserman. He was a Hollywood agent, came from relatively obscure background in Cleveland. They still never found his birth certificate. And he rises to the head of Hollywood's most powerful agency, and then he wants to buy a studio. Now, up to this point, he has no interest in government. He doesn't want to get involved in fundraising. Most of the Hollywood execs at the time were Republican, which is very different than today, but he was standing aloof from government. And then Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department starts investigating him, and he doesn't much like that, and he recognizes that this government thing is something he's got to deal with. And so he starts befriending presidents. He befriends John F. Kennedy a little bit, and then Kennedy's tragically assassinated, but then he becomes very close friends with Lyndon Johnson. And in fact, in 1964, as Johnson is at the cusp of a great landslide victory, Wasserman says to Johnson, I have a favor to ask you. Johnson kind of braces, well, what's the favor going to be? Because people ask him stuff all the time. And Wasserman says, I want you to promise me that I'll never have to serve in government. And so it's just such a relief to Johnson that he was happy to grant that favor because so many people were entreating him for government positions. So Wasserman befriends Johnson and really starts the pipeline of liberal money from Hollywood to Washington. That really wasn't a big thing before Wasserman. He also is able to make friendships on both sides of the aisle, and his friendship with Ronald Reagan based on when he was Reagan's agent and got Reagan his first $1 million contract in Hollywood. That friendship is something that carries over into the White House, and it sometimes, in some occasions that I write about in the book, actually affects policy.
Speaking of Wasserman, I think one reason that he might have gotten into the political game in the first place is because, as you tell in the book, in 1962, when his company MCA merged with Universal, there was an antitrust action against that temporarily blocked that from happening. Do you think his entree into politics and his preference for staying behind the scenes was based off of that incident and trying to avoid a repeat, or do you think it was just his temperament as an agent to let the stars be the stars and he'll make things happen behind the scenes?
Well, it's in a way it's both. I mean, he is spurred to go into politics based on that 1962 incident you talk about with the antitrust investigation from Kennedy's Justice Department. But he always had this theory about staying in the background, and he had rules for agents. First of all, his agents had to wear black suits, no color, no splash, and white shirts. But then he also didn't want his agents to become stars themselves, and he would say, "Stay out of the spotlight. It fades your suit." So he had a very specific way of going about things, and I think he took that attitude to his dealings with Washington. I mean, he was very close to Lyndon Johnson. He would stay up late at night in the Johnson White House talking to Johnson. In fact, at one point, he runs into Mrs. Johnson when Wasserman is leaving LBJ's bedroom, and he thinks she's going to yell at him, and he apologizes for keeping the president up so late, and she says, "Oh no, you don't understand. He lives for these conversations." Because there's this concept of the loneliness of leadership. CEOs and presidents really have no peers sometimes, and they feel like there's no one they can talk to, but they can talk to each other. So Wasserman really had these rules about how to deal in business, and he applied them to Washington, and I think they were pretty effective for him.
Now, of course, some CEO and presidential interactions cross ethical boundaries, we'll put it that way. Which way does causality run? Do CEOs corrupt politicians, or do politicians corrupt CEOs?
Well, it obviously could go both ways, but in my book, in The Power of the Money, I intentionally am trying not to pick people who are unethical or people who went to jail or did anything bad. I may not agree with their political decisions or their strategic decisions, but I'm really not trying to foster this idea of everything's corrupt and everybody's really some kind of criminal. I'm just trying to show how these people who are trying to be stewards of their companies, who are trying to think about shareholder value, how they are operating in a very challenging environment where government has more and more power, and sometimes presidents like Roosevelt against Rockefeller see advantages in targeting them as villains, and they're just trying to make a go of it and make their companies successful, even as government imposes certain roadblocks along the way.
A lot of the CEOs that we meet in The Power and the Money work in media in various forms, print, Hollywood, TV. In the early days of journalism, about the 1930s, Henry Luce pioneered a technique, well, either him or some of his journalists pioneered a technique called the breakfast technique. Can you tell the story of what that is?
Henry Luce is the founder of Time magazine. He founds it in 1923, and his idea is that there's no real national news source. You might have a big paper like the New York Times, but there's no national news source that's giving the news equally to people in California, as in New York, as in Iowa, as in Kansas. His insight is to create something like that, and by the 20s, the technology exists that this can happen. The distribution mechanisms are there, and the interest is there. And so he has a special focus on personalities, particularly on the president. He has an item in Time called the President's Week, where they talk about what the president's been up to. As a presidential historian, it's a great archive for things that presidents do, or things they said, or events they were at. And he also has this thing called the breakfast technique, where he would take, or one of his journalists would take a political figure to breakfast, and as they report on what the person said, he would also report on what they ate. And so there's this great example of Alf Landon, who is the 1936 candidate for president. He was the governor of Kansas. He's assumed by many that he's going to win the 36 election because the polls say he's going to win, but he loses very badly because pollsters at the time did not recognize that the only people answering polls were people who had telephones. The people who had telephones were wealthier and therefore more inclined to vote against Roosevelt and for Landon. So it was not a statistically significant poll in any way. But in any event, the interview with Landon includes the fact that he had kidneys for breakfast. And there's a guy named Lance Morrow who writes for the Wall Street Journal frequently. He was he was a writer for Time for many years. And he said even recently, so this is 90 years ago, he says, no one who read that article ever forgot the kidneys.
Yep, that is now seared into my brain. But it seems like it's at least an attempt, maybe not in Landon's case, but an attempt to humanize great personalities who are rich and famous and successful and make them seem a little more like you and me. Are there modern equivalents to the breakfast technique, like maybe politicians doing TikToks, something like that?
Politicians are always trying to find ways to show themselves to be human or regular. I mean, Donald Trump has spelling errors in his tweets. I don't think they're unintentional. I mean, I think there's some method to them. I also think that you see politicians have podcasts today. You think about different senators who have Twitter accounts where they bring more of their personality into it. So I do think that politicians try to show themselves to be regular people. Now, it's not always the case because they're not always regular people, and I've met with a lot of them, but a lot of them are. When I was in the White House, I used to tell staff that were intimidated by famous names that they read in the newspaper, they put on their pants or their skirts one leg at a time like everybody else. And so they are people. They just have they have jobs that sometimes can go to their heads.
Yeah, that same impulse existed 100 years ago. It still exists today. Sometimes I wonder if some of the politicians involved are actually human. But speaking of human universals and how they express themselves differently over time, you talk about how Time magazine during the 1950s was rabidly pro-Eisenhower, very partisan, to the point where it even impinged on their credibility. You write that on page 88, the famed Marshall McLuhan wrote of Time's rapid-fire prose, encouraged a sub-rational response. That sounds to me like an old-timey version of Trump advisor Steve Bannon's flood the zone strategy, and also the way that a lot of the very online people engage with politics today. Maybe we're not in uncharted waters after all?
I wonder if that's the first time anybody ever put Marshall McLuhan and Steve Bannon in the same sentence. I think Bannon would appreciate it, and McLuhan would have been mortified. But
I would be mortified.
But in any event, yeah, I think that there is something going on there with I guess the McLuhan approach to Time magazine, and Time did lean pretty hard in for Eisenhower at Luce's explicit direction, because some of the staff members did not want to be as supportive of Eisenhower, but Luce recognized an opportunity in Eisenhower, and he wanted to have a president who he was friendly with, in stark contrast to Roosevelt, whom he hated. And he, even after Roosevelt died, Luce said, "It is my duty to go on hating him." So even beyond the grave, he was still hating Roosevelt. But Time did suffer as a result, and there was a joke I lay out in the book, and as I think you noted, that there are many jokes in the book. I even have an appendix of all the jokes that I found that were told by or about CEOs, and that in itself is, I think, worth the price of admission. But the joke about Time was that Time at this time was bipartisan, because half the time it praised the Republicans and the other half it bashed the Democrats.
I like that a lot. Facebook has come under fire for similar reasons. They're not in the tank for Eisenhower. I don't think anybody is these days. But a lot of Republicans went into grievance mode and said that they're in the tank for Democrats, and there are a lot of people on both sides saying that Facebook pushes misinformation on people and can change election results. I'm a little, not fully skeptical, but mostly skeptical of that, partially because I can't name a single person who has changed their vote because of something they saw on Facebook. And the other reason is that algorithms tend to push content not to new people, but to people who are already interested in the thing being pushed. So when you have Russian bots pushing pro-Trump and anti-Democrat propaganda, their reach is limited to people who mostly already buy into that point of view. So it's not so much changing elections so much as reinforcing what people already believe. I don't know, do you think there's something to that, or do you think Facebook and other social media sites are having a more pernicious effect?
Facebook is a tool. What I have found in my studies of presidential history is that as new technological tools, as new media tools are developed, campaigns adapt them and use them, and the ones who adapt to them first and are skillful about it can be more successful. So Franklin Roosevelt was brilliant in his use of the radio. John F. Kennedy was so skillful with television that after he won the 1960 race, he told one of his aides, "We wouldn't have had a prayer without that gadget." And then in the 2000s, you start to see these kind of internet-enabled technologies. In 2004, the Bush campaign, for which I worked, had this micro-targeting strategy that was very effective. It was pre-Facebook, but it was a useful way of identifying who their voters were. And with respect to Facebook, both sides have reason to point to something that Facebook did to help the other side that they don't like. So in 2008, a lot of Facebook aides are helping Obama and his high-tech apparatus in the campaign, also in 2012. So there's a lot of pro-Obama sentiment among Facebook executives, and they actually went and helped the Obama campaign. In 2016, the Trump campaign pretty cleverly uses Facebook not to convince people who were going to vote some way to vote another way, but actually to suppress the Hillary vote. And I don't mean suppress in a nefarious way, but to discourage people who are kind of not so excited about Trump, not so excited about Hillary. They would put out information about Hillary to make people less inclined to vote. Those people might have been Hillary voters, and that was a benefit to the Trump campaign. So both sides have used Facebook, have found some success with Facebook. Those things in themselves are not necessarily Facebook's fault, but Facebook is increasingly unpopular and is seen by both sides as some kind of villain or bugaboo.
Which has made life very difficult for Mark Zuckerberg, who figures prominently in the later chapters of the book. Can you talk a little bit about how he has tried to thread a needle that probably cannot be threaded?
Yeah, look, in 2010, I talk about how Zuckerberg hosted a George W. Bush book event after Bush's memoir comes out, and I speculate, and I'm not the only one to speculate, I cite a source in this, that this was after the Republicans won Congress in 2010, and maybe they recognized that they needed to be nicer to the Republicans. Obama does events with Zuckerberg at Facebook headquarters and jokes about the hoodie and actually notices that Zuckerberg's nervous and kind of makes fun of him for kind of being a little sweaty at these events. So again, there is an effort to cultivate both parties. And then with Trump, you have Facebook, which has a very liberal staff. You've got a person in Trump who is kind of universally disliked among senior Facebook people. But at the same time, Zuckerberg is trying to maintain relations with Trump, and he has dinner with Trump in the White House. And there's one incident in the book where I talk about where Facebook and the White House, or Zuckerberg and the White House, were talking about an issue, and Zuckerberg was kind of sympathetic to the White House view, but he was complaining that his staff was on a different side of the issue. And then they were snickering among the White House staff saying, well, Mark's with us, but he's afraid of his liberal staff. So you, as a CEO today, especially in these high-tech companies, you have to take into account what your staff thinks. And the reason Jamie Dimon and, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg can take different approaches, because Dimon's got employees all over the country, whereas Facebook is more, not completely, but more concentrated in liberal areas in California, and they're more likely to have a more liberal staff. And so that staff isn't so excited about seeing the CEO of their company befriending Donald Trump.
So the barely a Democrat strategy might be the right idea for Zuckerberg, but it's very, very difficult to execute.
Yeah, it's harder for Zuckerberg to do the barely a Democrat than it is for Dimon. And in fact, Zuckerberg's employees don't want him to be barely a Democrat. They want him to be a full-in Democrat.
You also go into the Hunter Biden laptop story, which I've enjoyed ignoring as completely as I can since it popped up. But you document some pretty bad behavior among some of the progressive staff at several social media companies and trying to downplay that story. I think that might have created a little bit of a Streisand effect, where it actually, once people caught on to what they were doing, that actually amplified the story completely against what they're going for. And ties into something we've at CEI have been talking about in antitrust cases related, at least the Republican ones that are more grievance-oriented, something I call the dozen keystrokes argument, where if you want to type in nypost.com, it's 11 keystrokes, and then you can read about Hunter Biden's laptop all you want. So the social media companies might try to jigger the algorithm into their favor, but I don't know. Are there limits to their power?
Well, of course, there's limits to the power, and one of the things I talk about in the book is how I would say that we have more free speech today than ever before. If you look at Supreme Court jurisprudence, you can pretty much say what you want. The question is, do you have a platform on which to say it? And so if Facebook is limiting your ability to get your message out, it's not a First Amendment violation, but it may be censorship or a form of censorship. And I think that's really where the issue is today. It's not about you being suppressed and told you can't speak. It's about whether you can get your message out, and do these social media companies amplify messages they like and kind of mute messages they don't like.
That's a good answer. I like that.
Thanks. I try.
I think in a perceptive book, I think maybe the most perceptive line that you have is near the end on page 258. You said that CEOs have helped create an environment in which government tells corporations what to do. But in doing so, it helps the corporations maintain their dominant positions in the marketplace. It is this symbiosis, widely recognized or not, that helps explain the bipartisan resentment we see these days. That again ties into a lot of the antitrust work that CEI does. There's a rent-seeking component where you have CEOs rigging the system for favors, and politicians get to appear populist and anti-corporate at the same time. So there really is that symbiosis right there. That symbiosis has always been there since the Rockefeller days, and I think it always will be, but I don't know, do you see any avenues for reform that might...
Yeah, so let me push back on this a little bit. I'm not saying
Sure.
the CEOs are looking for favors per se. What I'm saying is that complexity is a subsidy. And so the more complex the rules
like
are, the easier it is for a large player to stay in business, because they can hire a big staff of regulatory attorneys and lobbyists and compliance officers, whereas a small, innovative company doesn't have the resources to do that, and it's harder for them to break in. Now, the reason we have these new tech companies is because new technologies create these opportunities for new players to enter the market. But the fact of the matter is, there is an ability of large legacy companies to maintain dominant positions longer than they would have otherwise because of regulatory barriers to smaller companies that can't quite fathom how to deal with the regulatory environment.
Like if, say, the government were to issue new content moderation algorithm requirements or some kind of safety compliance, Facebook and Twitter might be a little upset about having to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in compliance. But the upside to that for them is that it squashes the startup before it even gets big.
Yeah, and they won't say they're upset. In fact, whenever you hear the government say we need regulation in the tech industry or wherever, these companies say, yes, we want to work with you, government, on developing these regulations. And some of their insights are helpful, but other insights are insights that help maintain the dominant positions of the companies.
One last question. What's next for Tevi Troy? Are you going to complete the trilogy of Fight House and The Power and the Money? Or do you have something else in mind for your next project? Or is it too early to disclose?
Well, as you know, these books take a long time. I was working 4 solid years on this book in terms of developing the idea and then trying to find a willing publisher and then doing the research and then writing the book. And I actually have a rule that I never start writing a book until and unless I have a signed contract from a publisher. So it takes a long time to do these things. And I do promise my wife, as I said in the acknowledgments at the end of each book, that this is going to be the last one because it takes so much work. I've broken the promise a couple of times. Maybe I'll break it again. We'll see. But I don't yet have my next book in mind. But I do love the process. I love the researching. I love the writing. And I love going out and telling people about it. So because I'm such an addict, I probably will write something else in the future.
The book is The Power and the Money, The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. It's on sale at Amazon and all other booksellers. Those of you in the audience can use this little card here that you should have to get your own copy. A few housekeeping notes. On September 19, CEI is hosting our annual Julian Simon Memorial Award Dinner that will be at the National Cathedral. You can sign up for that at CEI.org. And we are always doing events like this, both here at our headquarters in D.C. and also on Capitol Hill and around town. So please keep an eye on cei.org/events. And with that, thank you very much for a wonderful event. Have a good day.